Today, I'm going to share with you 5 books that you need to read in order to become a millionaire or start a 7-figure business. And I'm going to tell you exactly why you need to read them. But before we get into the details, my name is Nolan Matthias, and if you want to thrive financially, this is the place for you. So go ahead and click that subscribe button. Okay, so let's start first and foremost with Start With Why by Simon Sinek. This book, by far, has had the single biggest impact on my life and my business of every book that I've ever read. And I've read over 500 books related to business and entrepreneurship, as well as psychology and personal development. And why has this book had the single biggest impact on me? Well, it turns out that for a long time while running my business, I lost my why. And when I lost my why, things got really, really difficult. You see, when I was coming out of university, I had a clear mission statement. It was to help people succeed financially so that they could give back beyond what they ever thought possible. And while I started with that intention in mind, eventually I lost track of that mission statement. You see, my industry is very much dollar driven. It's rarely about how many people you helped, but it's more about how many millions of dollars of transactions you did, or how big your team is, or how much money you made. And in 2013, after 10 years in the business, I was completely burnt out. That's when a really good friend of mine recommended Start With Why. And it was one of the best book recommendations that I had ever received. And the reason why is simple. It pointed out to me that people don't care about what you're selling or what you're doing. They care about why you're doing it. Then they care about how you're doing it. And then last but not least, they care about what you're doing. You see, when people asked me what I did and I told them that I had a mortgage company, they never really cared. But when I told them that I had a company that inspired people to thrive financially, that's when they started to care. And by the way, that why statement, to inspire people to thrive financially and give, is the why statement that I developed back in 2013 when I read Simon Sinek's book. And to say that it has changed my life and my business would be an absolute understatement. So I always recommend to new entrepreneurs and people who are just looking for what they want to do with their life to read Start With Why, because it will help you develop your why statement and help you determine what it is that you actually want to do with your life. And this, as far as I'm concerned, is the single most important piece when it comes to becoming a millionaire or building a 7-figure business. Now, once I found my why statement, the question was how? How do we go about building the business and becoming a millionaire from that business? And the book that helped me the most with that was this one, which is called The Go-Giver. Now, this book was given to me by an uber successful 9-figure businessman, somebody who had built a $100 million business. And this is honestly one of the most powerful stories about business that I've ever read. In the form of a parable, it discusses the 5 stratospheric laws of success. They are the law of value, the law of compensation, the law of influence, the law of authenticity, and the law of reciprocity. And I can tell you right now that without this book, this YouTube channel and the 3 million people it has reached would not exist. Because the first law, the law of value, which is the one that talks about giving more than you receive and giving without the expectation of something in return, is the reason why this channel was developed. Because this channel has always been about me giving the best financial advice that I possibly can in order to help people thrive financially. And I did so in the beginning without the expectation of anything in return. And for the first 3 or 4 years, I literally received nothing in return for building this YouTube channel. In fact, it wasn't until the last couple of years that this YouTube channel actually became its own viable business. But because I kept giving and giving and giving, it has now become a significant portion of our income and a lot of the reason why we have a 7-figure business today. And honestly, this book is such a quick read. You can literally get through it in 2 or 3 hours. The first time I read it was on a flight from Denver to Calgary. It is super easy to digest and super entertaining at the same time. So if there's one book that I recommend that you're going to read out of all of these, just from the perspective of reading something that's easy and that you'll definitely get through, it is The Go-Giver. Now, the next book on my list is The Only Investment Guide You Will Ever Need. This was recommended by Mark Cuban. I had never heard of it, and to find information on this book at this time is still really, really difficult. However, this has turned out to be one of the most important books I've ever read, and in the last year when inflation has been high, this has been one of the books that has guided many of the videos on this YouTube channel. So when I talk about saving money and how saving money has a better return than investing, this is where it is coming from. And one of my favorite chapters of this book is actually in the appendix. It's 2 pages and it talks about buying cases of wine and how that can earn you up to 177% return on your money. Yes, 177% by buying cases rather than buying single bottles. And essentially the premise of this whole story is this. When you buy a single bottle versus a case, you tend to be able to get a discount on a case of wine, typically around 10%. And in his example, he suggests that if you're the type who drinks a bottle of wine per week, that it is actually better for you to buy by the case because the return on investment is significant. In fact, it's far better than pretty much any investment that you could make in the stock market or ETFs or anything like that. And the reason is because let's say if you're buying $10 bottles of wine, you're tying up about $98 every single time you buy a case, but you're having a 10% return on that $98 because of your savings. But then you have to factor in that that savings is with after-tax dollars. And without getting into the details, when you really start to dig into the numbers of this, it turns out that buying wine in advance by the case earns you about 177% return just by getting a 10% discount. Now take that and apply that to everything that you buy over the course of a year that is something that can sit on a shelf, things like your pasta, things like your canned goods. And if you buy those things on sale, it ends up being a far better return than anything that you will get in the stock market. So the lesson here, and my favorite lesson of this book, is a penny saved is better than 2 pennies earned. And while people will go to extravagant lengths in order to invest their money and have it return higher amounts, those same people very rarely pay attention to how much money they're spending at the grocery market and everywhere else. And don't get me wrong, this book isn't just about savings. This book is about far more than that. But that just happens to be one of my favorite little topics in this book. And if you read just this book, I truly believe it is the only investment guide that you will ever need. All right, so fourth on my list is actually a 2-for-1. This is 2 books by Robert Kiyosaki, The Cash Flow Quadrant and Rich Dad Poor Dad. Now, I started off by reading Rich Dad Poor Dad early in my career. And in this book, he talks about his rich dad and his poor dad, and basically how his rich dad uses good debt in order to buy investments, and those investments end up making him wealthy. And it is a really great place to start. Now, whether you love Robert Kiyosaki or not, he's kind of gone off the deep end, in my opinion, on a few ideas lately, especially some of the conspiracy theories that he promotes. The Rich Dad Poor Dad is, in my opinion, the single best book to start you into real estate investment because it talks about how to buy properties and use them in order to generate cash flow, which eventually will allow you to wake up every morning and do whatever you want to do without having to rely on your job. Now, to take that one step further, he wrote The Cash Flow Quadrant. And this has been one of the most transformational books of my career because what this book talks about is how to go from being an employee to being self-employed to being a business owner to being an investor, and making the transition in that order from being an employee to then being self-employed to being a business owner to being an investor is essentially how you can create wealth. And I have based a lot of the ways that we've set up our business to this day, as well as our investments, on this book. So let me tell you how that looks like from my career perspective. So when I finished university, even though I was making good income as a mortgage broker, I actually took a year and became an employee. I started working for one of the largest technology companies in the mortgage industry in Canada. And at the end of that year, I was called up by my boss and I was told I was getting the biggest raise of everybody on the team, 2.5%. And while I was honored that I was getting the biggest raise out of everybody, it actually turned out that nobody else got a raise that year. I was a little bit pissed off. The value my company placed on me was essentially an extra $1,250 per year. And it was in that moment where I was getting a raise, a reward, that I realized that I needed to leave the life of being an employee permanently. I needed to move to a job or a role where my income would be scalable. And that was when I returned back to mortgage brokering. And it was at this point that I became self-employed. And I really was self-employed. I had to do literally everything myself. I had to do the applications, I had to do the underwriting, the documents, the compliance, everything that came along with being a mortgage broker was on me. And after a few years of this, it became clear that I needed to move more towards being a business owner. That's when I started hiring people. That's when the company really became a business. And what really made it a business was the fact that I didn't have to do everything. In fact, the reason I'm able to do this YouTube channel now is because every single job that I had at the mortgage company at Mortgage 360 is now done by somebody else. Every single one of them. That company runs completely without me. I am now the owner of that business, but not somebody who works in it on a day-to-day basis. But becoming a business owner wasn't the end of the journey. I needed to become an investor. And that is why a few years ago, I invested in a gelato company as an angel investor and started buying up real estate. Because those investments now pay me on a monthly basis. All I have to do is wake up in the morning and the checks come in. And by the way, some might suggest that owning investment properties is a job. Well, just like with my mortgage company, I have somebody hired out to do everything on the investment properties as well. And at some point in the future, I will literally, after accumulating enough investments, be able to wake up and do whatever I want, anytime I want. And that that, in my mind, is a true definition of wealth. In fact, I recently defined it as this. It's being able to get on any flight, anytime, in business or first class, and go anywhere in the world without having to worry about my schedule, without having to worry about the cost, and simply being able to live in the moment. Now, last but not least is my fifth most important book when it comes to becoming a millionaire or starting a seven-figure business, and that is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, this was a book that I read early in my career, and I'm glad I did, because this book laid the foundation for building my businesses and having the successful career that I have today. And in this book, Stephen Covey talks about, believe it or not, the 7 habits of highly effective people. And I do believe that these 7 habits are what led to a lot of my success. The 7 habits are: be proactive, begin with the end in mind, put first things first, think win-win, seek first to understand, then to be understood, synergize, and sharpen the saw. Now, of these, the 3 most important ones to me have been, first and foremost, to be proactive. Everything that I do on a daily and weekly basis, and everything that I teach my people in my mortgage company, is to be proactive. Try to get ahead of the problems before they happen, or even better, in order to prevent them from ever happening. In fact, this is why our mortgage company has been so successful. It is because quite often we are ahead of the problems before the client even realizes they have happened. And in a lot of cases, they never realized there was actually problems in their process. And that has allowed us to build one of the smoothest processes in the mortgage industry. It is simply a frictionless process that reduces the friction and the negative feelings that typically go along with the mortgage application process. Now, the second one, begin with the end in mind, is another one that has been hugely important, because anytime that we go to build something like this YouTube channel, or we go to build a company like Mortgage 360, or we invest in a property or something else, we're always thinking about what the end goal is for that business or that investment. And by doing so, we're able to map out what we think the stages of the process of building those investments and those businesses will be. And that allows us to be more strategic, typically allowing us to make more money and become more successful. And then the third one, and this is probably the most important one in this book, is to think win-win. We're always looking for the win-win options. How do we not make the other guy feel like they lost in a negotiation? How do we make it so that we get what we need and the client gets what they need? How do we find a synergistic solution where everyone finds themselves in the best possible situation at the end of the deal? And in a lot of situations in my career, I've chosen not to do a deal at all because it wasn't a win-win situation. Some of you who have followed this channel for a long time may have noticed that we did a deal last year and it ended very abruptly within about a month of it starting. And the reason why was because it quickly became clear that it wasn't going to be a win-win situation. In fact, in order for me to participate in that deal, the other guy would have had to do significantly better than I would have in order to make it possible. So it was just something that we weren't going to do because the other guy wasn't going to play fair. And in this way, the 7 habits of highly effective people has set me up both when I was an employee and when I was running different businesses for success right from day one. So if there's one book that I recommend for very young people, maybe in their early 20s, to read, it is that 7 habits of highly effective people, because it had a huge impact on me and my future career. In fact, I can probably say if I hadn't read that book early in my career, I probably would have never gotten to where I am today. So those are the 5 books I recommend in order for you to become a millionaire or start a 7-figure business. I'll link all of them in the description below. And in the meantime, check out these videos here.